The wind on Blackwood Ridge never whispered, it screamed. And anyone who ever stood up there knew the sound meant either survival or the end. Folks down in Sweetwater used to say only two things endured that savage cold: the Gray Wolves and Thanos Mercer, and on that night both were being tested again. The storm tore at the pines like a starving animal, flinging snow so sharp it burned the skin like crushed glass, and Thanos Mercer sat on the porch of his mountain cabin rocking slowly in a chair he had carved with his own hands 10 years earlier, the wood worn smooth by time and solitude. The old thermometer nailed to the post read 20 below, but Thanos didn't need numbers to know the truth. This was killing cold, the kind that snapped frozen branches like bones and turned a man's breath into ice before it left his mouth. At 52, he felt older than the ridge itself, his knuckles swollen and misshapen, his legs stiff from an arrow wound taken long ago, his face split by a jagged scar earned in a grisly fight he barely survived. He lived alone because silence asked nothing of him. Silence didn't judge, didn't demand, didn't remind him of the man he had once been before life stripped him down to what remained. Inside the cabin, Buster, his one-eared wolf dog, lifted his head from the rug and growled low, a warning sound that carried weight. "Easy," Thanos rasped, his voice like gravel sliding down a dry creek bed. Just the wind, but Buster didn't settle, his hackles rising as he stood stiff and stared at the door. Thanos felt it then, not fear exactly, but pressure, a presence that didn't belong to the storm, and his hand went to his rifle with slow practiced calm as instincts older than pain woke up inside him. He blew out the lamp and let the darkness swallow the room except for the dull orange glow bleeding from the stove vents, and then it came, a heavy thud that wasn't wind, followed by a weak scraping sound like something clinging to life with its last strength. Thanos stepped closer to the door and shouted through the thick wood that he wasn't buying, wasn't selling, and didn't have anything worth stealing, warning whoever it was to move on or be buried where they stood. No answer came, only that pitiful scratching that set his teeth on edge. Cursing under his breath, Thanos unlatched the heavy oak door and kicked it open, and the blizzard roared inside like a living thing, snow swirling across the floor in a white rush. At his feet lay a collapsed bundle of frozen rags, already being swallowed by drifting snow. Too long out there, he thought grimly, lowering his rifle as he grabbed the bundle by what looked like a coat collar and dragged it inside before slamming the door shut against the storm. The cabin dimmed again, warmed only by firelight, and when he flipped the body over, he saw it wasn't a man. The hood slipped back, revealing hair the color of dried wheat, tangled and stiff with ice, a young woman's face pale blue around the lips, eyes closed, skin hard with cold. Thanos froze as memory struck him hard and merciless. 10 years hadn't erased that face, hadn't dulled it, hadn't softened what it meant. "Clara Holloway," he whispered, the name cracking the silence like a rifle shot. Clara Holloway, the storekeeper's daughter, the girl with green eyes and a yellow ribbon. The last person who ever looked at him like he wasn't already dead. She groaned softly, eyelids fluttering, and when she breathed his name, just one word, it hit him harder than any bear ever had. "You foolish girl," he growled, fear tightening his voice despite himself. "What were you doing on the ridge in this hell?" There was no time for questions or memories. She was freezing to death, and Thanos moved with rough urgency, stripping away the frozen buffalo coat, tugging off her boots, rubbing warmth back into her hands and feet with palms that had never learned gentleness. He wrapped her in wool, lifted her enough to bring a cup of hot water with a splash of whiskey to her lips, telling her to drink slow, watching as she coughed and swallowed and color slowly crept back into her cheeks. When her eyes finally opened, green and piercing and far too familiar, she whispered that she had found him. "You found a way to die," Thanos snapped, backing away as if distance could protect him from the past standing up in his cabin. "The pass is closed and no horse could make it." "I walked," she said, voice trembling. 3 miles. My horse went down in a drift." He stared at her in disbelief, the kind earned only by madness or desperation. "You came here to me, why?" She looked down at the blanket wrapped around her shoulders and said quietly that she had to, and Thanos turned toward the window, staring into the white blur outside because he needed something solid, something that wasn't Clara Holloway breathing in his cabin. "Storm's setting in," he muttered. "You're stuck here till it breaks. Could be 2 days, could be a week." She hesitated, then told him gently that she didn't have a husband anymore, and his jaw tightened around memories he refused to touch. He didn't ask how or why. He let the snow bury the questions. The next day passed with few words as he cooked stew, fed the fire, and pretended her presence didn't tear him open, while she moved quietly through the cabin, mending a shirt without asking, sweeping the floor like she had always belonged there. It was the second night when she finally said what he'd been avoiding, pointing out that he hadn't asked why she came, and when he muttered that it didn't matter and he wasn't a priest for confessions, she snapped at him to stop, fire flashing in her voice as she told him to stop acting like stone because she knew him. He stood saying she only knew a man who wasn't here anymore, and she whispered that he was running from what scared him. "I'm too old for marriage," he snapped, "too old for starting over, too old for a woman like you." And she stepped close enough that he could smell lavender on her skin, telling him softly she hadn't come for a gentleman but for the only man she ever trusted. His heart kicked against his ribs as he said her name like a warning, and she shook her head, telling him she had waited 10 years. Outside, the storm screamed on, but by morning it eased, leaving behind a silence sharper than the cold, heavy with all the words they hadn't said. Thanos stood at the window, breath fogging the glass, muscles tight as if bracing for a fight he didn't want, while behind him Clara cradled a mug of coffee, fingers trembling from fear and exhaustion and secrets held too long. She told him there was something he needed to know, and when he told her not to, she said he had to hear it, stepping closer and confessing she hadn't come only for shelter, but because it wasn't safe for her in Sweetwater anymore. That made him turn, seeing fear in her eyes that had nothing to do with weather. And when he asked what happened, she spoke of Arthur, her husband, of money and temper and fists, of vows and shame and nowhere else to go, his grip whitening on the sill as she told him 3 days earlier. Arthur had come home drunk and gone after her boy. "Your boy?" Thanos said, stunned, and she nodded, saying Toby was 7 and hidden with Widow Miller. "Where is Arthur now?" Thanos asked, and when she said he was dead and told him about the struggle and the gun going off, about protecting her son and doing it again if she had to, Thanos breathed out slow and dangerous as she added that Sheriff Bull Holloway knew and was coming, that he wouldn't care about self-defense, only blood. Thanos buckled his belt with deliberate calm, saying she shouldn't have come here, and when she said she had no one else and trusted only him, his growl that she trusted the wrong man died as Buster sprang up barking. "Danger closing fast." "They're close," Thanos said. And when she whispered already, he confirmed they used the storm for cover, knowing Bull wasn't smart, just angry. He scanned the ridge and saw 5 riders moving through the drifts with Bull leading, then went back inside and told Clara they wouldn't talk or run their way out. They would fight. He handed her an old peacemaker, heavy and cold, instructing her with soft steel in his voice, promising that if he fell, she would run, get her boy go west, and when she promised, the first gunshot shattered the morning. Air and the war at his doorstep truly began. The first bullet cracked the frozen morning like a split log, and Clara flinched hard while Thanos did not even blink. He cracked the window shutter just enough to see the ridge and fired back, the shot striking the snow inches from Bull Holloway's horse, a warning more than an attack. "Mercer!" Bull's voice roared through the storm-thinned air. "Send out the woman and I might let you die clean." Thanos worked the lever and fired again, the round snapping, Bull's hat clean off his head and sending it tumbling into the drifts. "That's my answer," Thanos shouted, his voice carrying with the force of a man who had nothing left to lose. Gunfire erupted in reply, bullets slamming into the cabin walls, glass exploding inward, the stove rattling on its legs as if trying to crawl away. Thanos moved like years had peeled off him, his body remembering what his mind never forgot. Lever, fire, duck, reload, every motion clean and efficient. Clara crouched behind the overturned table, heart hammering but eyes sharp, clutching the revolver exactly the way he had shown her, watching the back door, the shadows, every place danger could crawl through. Smoke drifted through broken glass, the sharp smell of powder stinging her nose, and then she heard it, a crunch of snow behind her that didn't belong. "Thanos," she screamed. And the back door exploded inward as Deacon Jones burst through, Shotgun raised, his face twisted with cruelty. Clara lifted the peacemaker with both hands and fired, the recoil knocking her backward as the bullet smashed into the doorframe. But it was enough. Deacon flinched and fired wild, the blast shredding the ceiling instead of her. And in the same heartbeat, Thanos spun, rage burning in his eyes as he slammed into Deacon with a force that defied age and injury. They crashed back out into the snow, rolling, punching, breath tearing from lungs as a gun skidded away into the white. Deacon's hand clamped around Thanos' throat, squeezing, and the world narrowed as Clara scrambled to her feet, hands shaking, lifting the revolver again and firing. This time she didn't miss. Deacon's body slumped over Thanos, who shoved it aside and dragged in a ragged breath, staring up at her with something new in his eyes, something hard-earned and real. "You did good," he panted, but there was no time to rest. Bull shouted orders from the ridge, men moving, torches arcing through the air. Fire caught fast, flames licking across the shingles, smoke thickening as the roof began to groan. "We're not staying," Thanos said, kicking aside a rug to reveal the hidden trapdoor beneath. "A root cellar," Clara gasped, and he muttered it was more like a foxhole as he lit a short fuse on a stick of dynamite, tossed it toward the door, and shoved her down into the dark before dropping in after her. The explosion above them was thunder and fire and splintering wood, the cabin ripping apart as the tunnel shook and dirt rained down. In the pitch black, Clara clung to his arm, whispering if it was over, and Thanos checked his bullets with deadly calm, telling her no, now we hunt. The tunnel was narrow and wet, carved years ago when danger had meant wolves and weather, not men with badges and grudges, and they crawled until it opened near the creek bed, roots parting as Thanos emerged into cold morning air, streaked with smoke, drifting across the ridge like a bad omen. "They'll track us," Clara said. And he answered that yes, they would, but they'd have to come down from the rim, buying time. The creek water bit, through leather boots as they moved, Clara stumbling under the weight of soaked cloth until Thanos steadied her despite the pain flaring through his wounded shoulder. Canyon walls rose slick and narrow around them, Buster trotting close and growling at scents above. And when Clara whispered how far, Thanos told her 3 miles east to an old trapper's line, a choke point with good rocks and cover. Then he went quiet, watching her shiver violently, lips pale, resolve burning through exhaustion. He touched her icy hand and told her quietly about an overhang ahead, blind from above, ordering her to go there while he drew them off. She refused, fear breaking through. But he said what mattered was staying alive, admitting he was slow, his legs done, unable to outrun them but able to buy time. "Promise me," he said. And after a terrible pause, she whispered that she promised. Thanos stepped from cover and fired up toward the rim, roaring for them to come get him as bullets rained down and he ran through knee-deep snow, wounded leg dragging, shots slicing his ribs and tearing cloth but not stopping him. He dove behind a fallen tree, bark exploding under gunfire, and saw Clara reach the overhang, safe for the moment. His chest heaved as he dragged himself along the creek bed, bleeding openly, not hiding, leading them where he wanted, until the canyon narrowed to a 10-foot-wide throat, a natural kill zone. He wedged himself between boulders and checked his weapons. Rifle with 3 rounds, revolver with 5, knife sharp, heart steady. Snow crunched ahead, and Bull Holloway appeared on horseback with 2 men flanking him. Wearing a new hat, stolen from one of his dead deputies, a grin carved into his face. "End of the trail, old man," Bull called. "Tell me where the woman is, and maybe I'll make it quick." Thanos leveled the rifle at his chest and said he wasn't telling him a thing and wasn't dying quiet. And when Bull mocked his bleeding and limp, Thanos told him he talked too much. Bull sneered that Clara was a murderer who killed his brother, and Thanos growled that she protected her boy, something Bull would never understand. When Bull spat hatred at the child, Thanos' eyes burned, as he vowed to tear him apart, even from the grave if he touched the boy. Bull raised his gun, boasting that Sweetwater belonged to them, and then a voice cut through the canyon, freezing Thanos' blood. Clara stood on a rocky ledge above them, wild-eyed and fierce, revolver steady in both hands, snow clinging to her hair and skirt. She shouted at Bull, telling him why Arthur hated Toby, why he beat him, why he called him a bastard, and when she cried that the boy wasn't his, that Toby was 9, The number struck Thanos like a hammer. 9. He had left 10 years ago, left behind a night he never forgot, and the truth roared. Through him as Bull pointed his gun at Clara. She fired first, chipping stone. Bull's return shot nearly knocking her from the ledge, and Thanos charged. Without thought, his rifle misfiring with wet powder as he barreled forward on wounded legs, a force of grief and fury shocking the riders. Shots tore into him, spinning him, grazing flesh, but he slammed into one deputy and drove his knife home before wheeling toward Bull as the sheriff leveled his pistol and sneered about killing his bastard. Thanos raised his revolver, too slow, when a single shot cracked and Bull jerked upright. A red bloom centered on his forehead as he toppled backward off his saddle. Clara stood below now, gun smoking, the last deputy fleeing in terror as silence crashed down. Thanos collapsed into the snow, blood spreading. Clara, screaming his name as she pressed her hands to his wounds and begged him to stay. His vision flickered as he whispered to tell Toby, and when she said no, that he would tell him himself. Darkness finally took him. Darkness held him for a long time. Not the cold black of snow or night, but a deep drifting place where sound came and went like distant waves. Thanos floated there between breaths, between pain and peace, aware only of weight and warmth and a voice that kept pulling at him, refusing to let go. He surfaced in fragments, the smell of herbs sharp in his nose, clean cloth against his skin, sunlight pressing gently through his eyelids instead of burning white snow. When he finally managed to open his eyes, the ceiling above him wasn't his cabin roof, wasn't charred beams or falling ash, but smooth boards washed in soft light. His chest ached, his shoulder burned, and every breath felt earned, but he was alive. Clara sat beside the bed, her face pale with exhaustion, eyes red-rimmed and shining with hope and fear tangled together. The moment she saw his eyes move, she leaned forward, pressing her hand to his forehead as if to make sure he was real. "You're awake," she whispered, her voice breaking in a way that told him she had done her breaking already. He tried to speak and failed, throat raw, so she gave him water and told him slow, always slow. "Where?" he rasped finally, the words scraping out of him. "Widow Miller's," Clara said softly. "You're safe, Bull's gone. Everyone knows it was self-defense, no one's coming." The tension eased from his chest just enough to let him breathe again. "And the boy," he whispered, fear clawing back. Clara hesitated just long enough for his heart to stutter, then smiled through tears and told him Toby was outside, whittling on the porch, keeping watch like he'd been told. Thanos closed his eyes for a moment, not from weakness but from something heavier, relief mixed with a grief 10 years deep finally cracking open. When she brought Toby in, the boy stepped carefully across the floor like he was entering sacred ground, a small pocket knife in his hand, curls of wood clinging to his fingers. Gray eyes, his eyes looked up at Thanos with quiet curiosity and respect. "Hello, sir," Toby said, and Thanos swallowed past the knot in his throat, telling him he heard the boy liked to carve. Toby nodded, shy but proud, and when Thanos held out his hand, guiding the grain beneath small fingers, something inside him settled for the first time in a decade. "You listen to the wood," he murmured, voice thick. "It'll tell you what it wants to be." Toby's face lit with wonder, asking if he could really teach him. And Thanos managed a smile that hurt and healed all at once as he said he had plenty of time. When the boy asked if he was his pa, the word landed gentle and devastating, and Thanos didn't hide the tear that slipped free as he answered yes and apologized for being late. Days blurred into each other after that, pain and healing measured in breaths and small victories. Clara never far from his side, her strength quiet and unshakable. News filtered in from Sweetwater about Bull Holloway's fall, about men finally speaking the truths they had swallowed for years, about Arthur's violence no longer hidden behind money and a badge. Thanos listened but didn't dwell on it. The war was over, and what mattered now was the fragile, precious work of living again. When he could finally stand, leaning heavy on a cane, he stepped onto the porch and felt sun instead of knives, heard wind that didn't scream but moved soft through trees, and watched Toby run the yard like it belonged to him. Clara stood beside Thanos, close enough that her shoulder brushed his, and neither of them moved away. There were things still unspoken between them, 10 years of distance and regret. But they no longer felt like walls, just roads yet to be walked. At night, when the house was quiet, Clara told him everything he had missed, every letter she never sent, every reason she stayed, and every moment she thought of him. And Thanos listened without turning away this time. He told her about the mountain, about choosing silence because it hurt less than hope, and when he finished, she took his hand and held it like it was something earned. Weeks later, when his strength returned enough to leave Widow Miller's place, they chose land just outside Sweetwater, close enough for community but far enough for peace. And Thanos built again, slower now but surer, with Toby handing him nails and Clara steadying beams. The house rose from the ground like a promise kept, wood shaped by hands that had learned patience, laughter filling spaces once meant only for echoes. At night they sat together, firelight warm on their faces, Toby asleep with wood shavings in his pockets, and Thanos felt something he thought he'd buried on Blackwood Ridge begin to breathe again. He wasn't the man he had been, but he was still a man who could protect, who could teach, who could love without running. And when Clara finally leaned her head against his shoulder, yellow ribbon catching the lamplight, Thanos knew the mountain had not broken him. It had only been waiting for him to come home in a different way. Months passed like a slow, healing breath, each day stitching something back, together that had once been torn. Thanos sat on the porch of their new home just outside Sweetwater, the board still smelling of fresh-cut pine, the wood shaped by hands that had learned patience instead of rage. The land rolled gently away from the house, grass bending under a kinder wind, and the sky stretched wide and blue without threat. Clara leaned against him, her shoulder fitting into his side as if it had always belonged there, a yellow ribbon tied in, her hair that fluttered softly, instead of snapping like it once had on. Blackwood Ridge, Toby, ran through the field with a kite Thanos had built from scrap cloth and thin slats of cedar, his laughter carrying clean and bright on the air. The sound rooted Thanos deeper than any mountain ever had. He watched his son run, watched the string tug and dance, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been locked tight for years. The wind moved across the land, and for the first time in his memory, it didn't scream. Didn't claw, didn't threaten. It sang low and steady, like it knew the fight was finally over. Thanos took Clara's hand, her fingers warm and sure in his rough grip, and spoke quietly, almost to himself, that he once believed he was too old for marriage, too worn down for beginnings, too broken for anything but solitude. Clara smiled, soft and knowing, telling him he had been wrong, and he kissed her forehead with a tenderness that surprised even him. "No," he said, eyes never leaving the boy racing the wind. "I was just waiting to be needed again, waiting to be a husband, a father, a man who stayed." Clara rested her head against his shoulder, the weight of her trust settling into him like something earned the hard way, and Thanos let the moment hold him. He had scars that would never fade, pain that would always remind him of what he'd survived, but he also had a home filled with breath and laughter, a woman who chose him not out of fear but faith, and a son who looked at him like the world made sense when he was near. As the sun dipped low, turning the fields gold, Toby ran back toward them, kite trailing behind, shouting that it flew because his pa knew how to listen to the wind. Thanos laughed then, a sound rusty but real, pulling the boy close and promising him there was still plenty to learn, plenty to build, plenty of days ahead. The mountain no longer owned him. The past no longer chased him, and the silence he once hid in had been replaced by something louder and stronger. Life, love, a future that didn't ask him to be who he used to be, only who he was willing to become. And as the evening settled in around them, Thanos Mercer knew the storm that had shaped him had finally passed, leaving behind ground strong enough to stand on and a family worth standing for.